It's 1958 and a major motion picture is about to premiere. The media is whipped into a frenzy because this is not just any film. A Night to Remember is based on a legendary book of the same name, and it details in graphic reality the sinking of Titanic, which had occurred just 46 years earlier. On the red carpet that night is the usual assortment of producers, directors, writers and actors, including massive names of the day like Kenneth More, but mixed in with that crowd were three elderly gentlemen who might have gone unnoticed by the press and the crowd, but their story and their importance couldn't be understated because they'd actually been there that night when Titanic had sunk. Their names were Joseph Boxhall, 4th officer, Herbert Pittman, 3rd officer, and saloon steward Walter Nichols. What these men had experienced that night was horrendous, and they had seen with their own eyes Titanic take her dying plunge. Now they were about to see it again. They stepped into the Odeon Theatre in London, and the projector fired up to premiere A Night to Remember to the world. It's a question I get asked a lot. Did any Titanic survivors see any of the movies, and if so, what did they think? Well, the answer is yes. Quite a few experienced the various movies made about Titanic, and the historical record has fortunately recorded their reactions, and some might surprise you. From the appalled and the offended, to the content and proud, and even one survivor who had to be prevented from joining on as an extra to experience the sinking all over again. Thanks to research of historians and some fine articles over at Encyclopedia Titanica, today we'll explore the reactions of Titanic survivors to the movies and see how accurately Hollywood portrayed the story. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Ocean Liner Designs, and this is what Titanic survivors thought of the movies. Chances are you've seen a movie about the Titanic at some point. A few people avoid the most famous one like the plague purely because it was so popular, but the fact is that Titanic movies have been enthralling audiences since the very year the ship sank. Now this story probably needs to begin in about May 1912, in the immediate aftermath of the Titanic disaster. Now, the news had shocked the world and become one of the first true smash global news stories, and naturally it generated an insatiable appetite for souvenirs, merchandise, and that newfangled entertainment media, the silent moving picture. Now, there was just one problem with this. Newsreel cameramen hadn't really bothered to film Titanic at all. The ship was so identical in exterior appearance to her sister ship Olympic that footage of the latter was modified to just pass it off as the genuine article. It helped that Titanic's lost captain, Edward Smith, had also skippered Olympic for her inaugural season, so this newsreel was shown to fascinated audiences and presented as Titanic. But the telltale sign that it had been faked are the tugboats. Their names in the port of registry have been scratched out frame by frame, because they would have said New York. And that's where this bit of footage of Olympic was shot, and of course, Titanic never made it to New York. It was a cruel and disingenuous trick, but it worked. Documentaries about Titanic actually continue to show this footage to this day. But it wasn't a movie in the real sense of the word, just recycled news footage. The race to output a film about the disaster was on, and it leads to probably one of the most bizarre sagas of the entire story. Dorothy Gibson was one of the first movie stars in an era where theatre performers were held in very high regard. At 22, she had boarded Titanic in first class and captivated the male passengers in particular. And on the night of the sinking, she'd actually been up late playing bridge whist, and she, along with her mother and a party of some of the bridge whist players, had boarded the first lifeboat to leave the ship. Now, incredibly, almost as soon as she got back to New York, Gibson was attached to a production about the sinking, aiming to capitalise on that massive international interest in the disaster. The film has been lost to history, unfortunately, but we know a little bit about it. Now, it probably used that same Olympic footage to give an air of authenticity, because the same producer who'd made that infamous newsreel was behind the new movie. To give it a touch more realism, Gibson actually wore the outfit she had worn aboard the lifeboat when she had evacuated the ship. Saved from the Titanic was released less than a month after Titanic had sunk, and in fact, filming took just 1 week, making use of a derelict transport ship to stand in for the lost liner. The film was a smash hit, with sold-out viewings across the US, but reviews weren't all good. First was the obvious fact that the film was a soulless attempt at cashing in on the disaster while the bodies of victims were still being recovered at sea. So what did survivors think of the film? Well, first there's Gibson herself, and while she may appear to have been a willing participant, it seems that the truth is a little bit more uncomfortable, that she may have been manipulated or pressured into it by the producer with whom she was having an affair. Now, throughout the production, Gibson's nerves were shot. She openly wept in the middle of filming. Her discomfort did not go unnoticed. One reviewer said that Gibson had the appearance of one whose nerves had been greatly shocked. Another reviewer called out the blatant exploitation, saying, "The bare idea of undertaking to reproduce in a studio, no matter how well equipped, or by reenacted sea scenes an event of the appalling character of the Titanic disaster with its 1,600 victims, is revolting, especially at this time when the horrors of the event are so fresh in mind, and that a young woman who came so lately with her good mother safely through the distressing scenes can now bring herself to commercialise her good fortune by the grace of God is past understanding." Now, what other survivors thought of this film is sadly lost to history, but maybe the reaction can be gauged by what happened to Gibson next, because she actually quit the movie business for good, and Saved from the Titanic became her last ever picture. Now, it wouldn't be until about the 1950s that any serious or worthwhile attempt was made at depicting the Titanic disaster on film again. By then, most of Titanic's survivors were now already elderly, but the passage of time brought some convenient factors for filmmakers. For one, many survivors were, over 40 years after the event, now ready to talk about their experiences. Researchers like Walter Lord were conducting more in-depth research about the disaster. Lord would release his findings in the best-selling book A Night to Remember in 1955. But 2 years earlier, in 1953, the first major Hollywood movie about Titanic was released, and many survivors from the real disaster jumped at the opportunity to go see it. The film, appropriately named Titanic, was released in 1953 to much acclaim, and it boasted a star-studded cast. But the film, objectively, was not that great. It was full of inaccuracies which will frustrate any serious Titanic nerd. For example, throughout the entire sinking, an annoying alarm blasts almost non-stop, which of course just didn't happen in real life. But given the scarcity of serious research done on the disaster and the fact that this was Hollywood's first attempt at depicting it, the effect was enthralling. Of course, newspapers rushed to interview survivors who had seen it, and fortunately, quite a few did. Eugene Daly had been a young third-class passenger aboard Titanic, and his survival was remarkable for the fact that so few passengers of his demographic actually made it off the ship alive. He had made himself known around the ship for his playing of the pipes as the vessel left his native Ireland. He tried to board one lifeboat early on in the sinking, but was forcefully pulled out of it, and in the end he narrowly escaped the sinking ship by helping free one of the collapsible boats from the ship's officers' quarters roof, climbing in from the freezing water after the boat had floated free of the wreck. When Titanic came out in 1953, Daly was then 72. He was quite complimentary of the film, saying that the producers had done a fine job of reproducing the feeling of the night, given they hadn't experienced it themselves. He liked it so much, in fact, that he went to go see it a second time, although he did criticise the lack of likeness between actor Brian Aherne and his character Captain Smith. Daly was especially touched by the depiction of Catholic priests offering absolution as the ship sank, something he said was one of the last sights he'd taken in from aboard the liner. Now, other survivors' reactions to the 1953 Titanic film were mixed at best. Actually, it's really an interesting depiction of the wide variety of testimonies that often conflict from the night's event itself, and demonstrate at least a little bit why eyewitnesses can sometimes be a little bit unreliable. Anna Nisten had been another third-class passenger, aged just 22. After the disaster, she often suffered nightmares, but in 1953 she overcame her trauma and went to go see the film. She cried all the way through it, and afterwards she said, "I wanted to see the picture, still not. I would not feel good if I didn't, but I cried. I remembered some things. The picture was wonderfully done." Another survivor was Bertha Moran, also from third class. As she watched the film, and the lifeboats were lowered away, she exclaimed, "It was just like that." She thought the movie was very good, even though reliving the memory of it must have been traumatizing since she had lost her brother in the sinking. Addie Wells was a second-class passenger aboard the ship. Of the movie, she said, "I don't see how those movie people got the scenery to look so real." She said it looked just like the Titanic as I remembered it. Other survivors were less enthusiastic about the movie. Percy Oxenham had been a second-class passenger aboard the ship who, after surviving, joked that he wouldn't return to England unless a bridge was built across the Atlantic. He criticised the 1953 movie, first for the depiction of the orchestra playing their instruments right to the end. He said, "There was no band playing accompaniment to Nearer My God to Thee. It was impossible to play because all the instruments were below in the quarters and the hatches were battened down." Now, this is an unfair criticism because although Oxenham might not have heard or seen the band, we know, of course, that they did actually play their instruments throughout the sinking. But his next point is a fair one. He pointed out that John Jacob Astor, Titanic's richest passenger, is depicted as selflessly giving up his spot in a boat for a woman with a baby. But in reality, Astor had actually asked to join his wife in a lifeboat, but was refused, so he simply stepped back. Jack Ryson, who'd been travelling with his family in first class, simply said that the movie was, quote, "not real." Interestingly, other survivors criticised the movie for being too depressing in its realistic representation of the ship's sinking, which when you think about it is probably more of a compliment to the film's production qualities given the circumstances. Survivors Leah Axe and Selena Cook watched the film together and it brought them to tears. Leah described it as depressingly realistic, a strange contrast to Cook, who called it good entertainment for everyone. Addie Wells, who had previously commented on the realistic sets and the special effects, agreed with Leah Axe when she called it terribly depressing. Now, plenty more survivors watched the film, but their reactions went unrecorded. Historical inaccuracies aside, obviously the opportunity to relive the events was a huge draw for many, either for closure or, as Selena Cook put it, for good entertainment. But nothing would come close to the hullabaloo just 5 years later, when Walter Lord's book was turned into a movie that still stands today as possibly the most accurate depiction of Titanic ever filmed. Incredibly, this time, surviving passengers, crew, and even the ship's own officers were brought in as consultants to help the accuracy and realism, and the results speak for themselves. A Night to Remember is considered one of the greatest historical films of all time because it did so much to avoid the overdramatization and the sensationalism that had been attached to the Titanic story for nearly 50 years since it sank. Walter Lord's book cut through the rubbish thanks to his exhaustive research. Now, fortunately, it meant that when it came time to make the film, the survivors he had interviewed already for the book and become friends with were eager to put their hands up to help with the film. And, to the filmmaker's credits, the producers were keen to oblige. Now, chief among the consultants for the movie was Joseph Boxhall. He had played a pivotal role in the voyage, the sinking, and the evacuation because he'd been Titanic's fourth officer. Titanic's sinking had been a source of despair to Boxhall ever since. He had barely spoken of it, so family and friends were actually surprised when he agreed to serve as a consultant on the film. Boxhall was naturally a quiet and reserved man. On the night of the sinking, he, as one of the junior officers, was on duty and made it to the bridge just after the collision. He performed an inspection of the damage and then, famously, was tasked with calculating the ship's position for distress calls to be sent on. His position was about 15 miles, or 30 kilometres, too far northwest of the real disaster site, but it was close enough so that the rescue ship Carpathia made it to pick up survivors just a few hours later. Now, this wasn't really an indictment of his seamanship because Captain Smith himself also made an incorrect calculation that was even more wrong. It could have been due to the bizarre atmospheric conditions which messed with the size and the brightness of stars in the sky, despite the clarity of the evening. Boxhall had escaped the sinking ship about half an hour before she took her final plunge, and when he finally stepped aboard Carpathia the next morning, his voice had broken with emotion as he reported to the rescue ship's captain just what had happened. The experience didn't kill his enthusiasm for the sea. In fact, he went on to serve aboard Titanic's sister ship Olympic, but he always was reluctant to recall the disaster that he had experienced. When he first found out about A Night to Remember, he was not impressed, and he wasn't keen on taking part in the production. But slowly, he was persuaded, thanks in part to his friend Commodore Harry Grattage, who had commanded many famous liners himself. After 2 months of back and forth, Boxhall agreed to help, saying it was his duty to, quote, see the old ship sink properly. Now, it might have started off reluctantly, but in the end, his involvement with the film became a real source of closure to Boxhall, who found a new lease on life because of it. Originally, he said he wouldn't even leave his home in Christchurch, but footage shows him walking wistfully around the A Night to Remember set. Of the production, he said, I have a great admiration for those film chaps who had to endure each shot being taken 3 times over in the cold October whilst floundering about in Ruislip Reservoir. Boxhall attended the premiere of the film in 1958, and sadly, his deeper thoughts on the film weren't ever made public. He said he was pleased with the result and impressed by the amount of money actually spent on the film. But fortunately, we have this one fascinating photo of Boxhall sat watching the film by himself. What he was thinking as he relived the events of that night will of course never be known, but it's definitely captivating. Now, Joseph Boxhall wasn't the only senior crew member to see the film. Herbert Pittman had been Titanic's third officer. He watched the movie at the premiere with his old colleague Boxhall, and he said, "The film is an excellent representation of what happened, and I can't recall a single technical mistake." Sylvia Lightoller was the widow of Second Officer Charles Lightoller, portrayed by the star of the film, Kenneth More. In fact, Sylvia is seen here being kissed by More in this rare newsreel film. She'd been a consultant on the movie too. In fact, she was portrayed early on in the movie. She was glowing in her praise for Moore's portrayal of her husband and said the film is really the truth and has not been embroidered. There's no doubt that Lightoller, who died just a few years earlier, would probably have leapt at the opportunity to help out on the project too. Now, another visitor to the Night to Remember set was Edith Russell, née Rosenbaum. She's one of those Titanic characters that is just so memorable. She was very spirited and extremely forthright. She'd travelled first class and tried to take insurance out on her large numbers of trunks and belongings, but she said she was told that since Titanic was virtually unsinkable, it was unnecessary. Now, on the night of the sinking, she said she'd actually seen the iceberg slip past her stateroom window as she was getting undressed. She quickly reported to the lifeboat stations up on the boat deck. Now, later on, she sent her steward back to her stateroom to retrieve a prized possession of hers, which was a little musical toy pig. Edith went on to become an accomplished journalist and even reported from the front lines of the First World War. But she was never afraid to discuss her experience of the Titanic sinking, and since she was being portrayed in A Night to Remember, she was invited to the set, and what she saw left a big impression. The film's producer, William McQuitty, toured her around, and the normally talkative Russell was left stunned. She stood quiet for a while, staring at the set, about a third of the ship's boat deck with two towering funnels and all the lifeboats on their davits. "I can't believe it," she said. "It was here that I stood." Once the film was released, Russell quickly set about watching it, and she actually had mixed feedback. She said Captain Smith is perfect, also the set and the gala dinner, the dining room, perfect. But they make me push my jewellery aside and take the pig from the stateroom, all different from fact, and it's a factual film. Now, probably one of the most touching reactions from any of those visiting the set was from Helen Melville Smith, who was actually Captain Smith's daughter. She'd been just 14 years old when her father had died with Titanic, and surviving letters portray Smith as a caring and devoted father. When Helen visited the set, she came face to face with Lawrence Naismith, who was actually playing her father, and she was understandably emotional about the whole experience. Now, one of the more funny stories concerning the production of A Night to Remember involves the survivor Lawrence Beasley. Now, he had actually boarded as a second-class passenger. In fact, he makes a small cameo in one of the more famous shots taken aboard the ship, up in the gymnasium for first class. Now, unlike some others, he was not reluctant to discuss the disaster. In fact, he published a memoir just 9 weeks after the sinking. When he got wind of the A Night to Remember production in 1957, the 80-year-old took it upon himself to gatecrash the production by sneaking onto the set dressed in period-correct 1912 clothing. There, a section of the boat deck had been recreated for scenes of the final plunge, and Beasley was apparently keen to go down with the ship once again. But at the last moment, before cameras started rolling, he was spotted and the game was up. Ostensibly because of actors' union rules, but also probably because subjecting an 80-year-old to freezing water in a sloping deck was inadvisable, Beasley was asked to leave the set. Quite a few passengers watched A Night to Remember, possibly because its reputation as an accurate portrayal and the fact that consultants had been used began to spread throughout the remaining survivors and the public as a whole, only adding to its appeal. Amazing insights came in from survivors all over the world. Richard Norris Williams had been a first-class passenger and a budding tennis player. He had actually travelled with his father, and on the night of the sinking, the pair had stayed on the ship until the last minute. They were part of the mob struggling around the collapsible lifeboats at the first funnel. Then that collapsing funnel had only just missed Richard, who looked on astonished as it crashed right down on top of his father and many more. He was pulled from the water, but his time in the freezing cold had taken a huge toll. His legs likely needed amputation thanks to the frostbite, but Norris refused. He overcame his condition and went on to become an accomplished tennis star, winning competitions even from 1912. He watched the film and said that it was restrained in its realism, but vivid in its portrayal. I could just visualize it happening again. In particular, the scenes of the collapsing funnel was something he described as chilling. Even Lawrence Beesley, who tried to sneak into the set, got to watch the film, and fortunately his actual response was captured by news cameras.
I thought it was most extraordinary. I had no idea that the realism could be produced in such a wonderful fashion.
Others were brought to emotion by the film. Gretchen Longley had been in first class, and she said, "I just had to cry as I kept thinking of that beautiful ship and all those wonderful people. I was returning from Europe with my 2 aunts. I refused the one remaining spot in the 3rd lifeboat to remain with them, but we found room in the 4th boat." Now, some of the feedback was highly positive. Writer May Futrell had lost her husband, the author and journalist Jacques Futrell, in the sinking. Obviously, the anticipation for the film's release was great. She was asked afterwards what she thought, and she said, "If you'd asked me that the first time I saw it, I couldn't have told you because I was too upset. But after the second showing, I can tell you I believe it to be remarkably accurate, honest, and an exciting film. More inaccurate nonsense has been written about the Titanic than I have time to tell you, but speaking for the portions of that picture that relate to my own experiences and to what I saw and heard, I can only tell you this is the way it happened. I was there, and I know." But the sad truth is that the vast majority of survivors who watched A Night to Remember found the experience to just be too emotionally exhausting. Renee Harris, the theatre manager and producer, had been travelling first class with her husband. When she boarded a lifeboat, she had actually jumped out of it, so desperate was she to stay with him, but she was finally evacuated just before the ship's final plunge, while her husband, Henry, remained behind and was lost. 46 years later, the pain was still too much. "I'm afraid I'm a sissy," she said. "I couldn't get myself to attend the premiere, but submitted to viewing it privately. I only watched the very beginning. It was so realistic. I couldn't take it." In fact, at a special screening of the film before its general release, she had walked out of the theatre. "I will never see the rest of this," she said. "It carried me too realistically back to that night." She later said, "It was a night to forget." Now, the same was true of 2 other survivors, Anna Bolton and Eva Hart. Anna said simply that when the boat started to sink, "I left." Eva had been just 7 years old when she boarded Titanic, but the memories were still fresh and vivid. She reflected on A Night to Remember when she said, "My personal feelings were mixed. I thought and still think it a really marvellous film, one which I doubt can be bettered, but there are 1 or 2 scenes of the actual sinking which I couldn't bear to watch. Although I've seen it many times, I still close my eyes when these come on the screen." Now, one survivor reaction to the film is particularly moving, even without any recorded verbal testimony. Emma Bliss was a stewardess aboard the ship. In 1958, she was in her 90s, and she watched the film, emotionally supported by her nurse. Her thoughts weren't recorded, but a series of photographs from the viewing show her simply breaking down at the side of the sinking. Now, naturally, with the passage of time, the number of Titanic survivors began to dwindle as they passed on. And by the time the 70s and the 80s and the 90s came around, when the next batch of Titanic films were ready for production, there were precious few people left who could actually remember the night of the sinking. In 1997, James Cameron's Titanic was released to global acclaim. Naturally, it sparked a huge revival in interest in the Titanic story, and there was a mad dash to secure the thoughts of survivors. The only issue was that there were very few left. Eleanor Johnson had been just 2 years old aboard Titanic, and her survival was remarkable as well because so few children from 3rd class had ever made it off alive. In fact, survival rates were around 40% or less. Of course, she couldn't really remember the events of the night, but she had vague recollections of being cramped into a lifeboat in her mother's arms and the screams of people around her. Eleanor was moved by the film, but enjoyed it nonetheless. In fact, she actually watched it 2 times and particularly enjoyed the opening scenes of the ship on the ocean floor. Other parts she found difficult to watch. "I did a lot of crying," she said. Milvina Dean was the last living survivor of the wreck, and her opinion of the movies was straightforward. She'd been just a child aboard Titanic too, but the disaster had left a lasting impact because she lost her father in the sinking. Watching A Night to Remember in the 50s had brought nightmares, and in 1997 she outright refused to watch James Cameron's film. To her, it was all too real. "The Titanic was a tragedy which tore so many families apart," she said. "I lost my father, and he lies on that wreck. I think it is disrespectful to make entertainment of such a tragedy." In May 2009, Milvina Dean passed away at 97 years of age, bringing to an end the living memory of Titanic. Now, all we can do is rely on testimony and research to bring that fateful evening to life. But fortunately, thanks to newspaper reports and rare interviews, we have an idea of what many Titanic survivors thought of the disaster in the years since, and their reaction to Hollywood's attempts at recreating it. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Ocean Liner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.